All right, we're back with part 3. I apologize for the end of the last one, but if Isaac Newton didn't force gravity upon us, then we wouldn't have had to watch that video. If you don't know what I'm talking about. And people who are just turning onto this one, they're like, what are you talking about, stupid? Just watch the second. You watch the end of it. It was something that had to be discussed. So this is part 3, 50 greatest historical events. We're on number 34. We are trucking along. So, there's a thanks button on the channel. You can donate. You don't have to. If you're just walking into this and you're thinking that I think that Isaac Newton invented gravity, I get why you think that no one should donate to the channel. I understand and I apologize. Yep. Subscribe if you know that Isaac Newton did not invent gravity. And give a thumbs up if you just feel bad.
Famous quote. Dr. Seuss is known for a lot of things. He invented the word nerd, made World War II propaganda films, and taught generations of kids that it's okay to invite strangers into your house and violate all of your parents' rules as long as you clean up and don't get caught. While Dr. Seuss has written a lot of memorable books, the constant use of nonsense words invented to fit the rhyming scheme prevent them from being highly quotable. However, there is one quote for which Theodore Seuss Geisel is most famous. Be who you are and say what you feel, because those who mind don't matter, and those who matter don't mind. It's a beautiful sentiment, and it certainly sounds like something Seuss would say, aside from the lack of rhymes, but he never actually did, or at the very least, there's no record of him ever saying it. Some of the earliest references to this quote are from the 1940s, and in both instances, it is the punchline in a joke about difficult seating arrangements at a party. Even earlier than that, in 1938, the quote appeared in a London-based engineering journal, again used as a punchline. In that instance, the line appeared in quotes despite not being attributed to anyone in particular, suggesting that it was just a common phrase or piece of wisdom at the time. The Bermuda Triangle. In the Atlantic Ocean, there exists a dangerous patch of sea known as the Bermuda Triangle. This vaguely defined area is the triangle roughly formed by Bermuda, Puerto Rico, and the Florida Keys. The area is known for its high rate of crashes, disappearances, and sunken vessels, often under mysterious circumstances. A boat or plane that entered the triangle might never be seen or heard from again. There are many attempts to explain why this area of sea is so cursed, most of which are supernatural in nature. Some offer scientific explanations, such as localized magnetic fields screwing with compasses and navigation equipment. But there is a much simpler explanation for the disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle, which is that it's a lie concocted by writers looking to make money with a sensational story. In reality, there is nothing mysterious going on. Many disappearances were total fabrications, and of those that really happened, ships that were considered missing but arrived late to port were still included in the tally to inflate the numbers and make them look more noteworthy. Considering the Bermuda Triangle is an area of the Atlantic that received exceptionally heavy traffic from boats, planes, and tropical cyclones, there was nothing disproportionate or mysterious about the number of lost vessels. The curse of the billy goat. Sports are full.
That's interesting. When you see all the pattern, you realize there's a lot of ships that pass through there. And you have to believe that sometimes a ship nearby, outside of that area, but still went down, they would have probably lumped it into going down into the Bermuda Triangle. But that was a lot of traffic through that area. So, not surprising.
Of superstitions. But it's not every day that an actual curse is placed on a team. William Sionis was the owner of the Billy Goat Tavern in Chicago, and as an avid baseball fan, he had gone to Wrigley Field to watch the Chicago Cubs play in the 1945 World Series. And either because he wanted to promote his business or just really loved animals, Sionis brought his pet Billy Goat with him to the game. Others in attendance found this goat Murphy to be disruptive, so Sionis and his pet were asked to leave. Enraged, Sionis placed a curse on the team, condemning them to never play in the World Series again. The Cubs lost the game and the series, and it really seemed like they'd never compete in the World Series again. This is how the story was always told, but it's unclear what, if anything, Sionis said when he was ejected from the stadium. The most common accounts are either that he said nothing, or that he angrily stated, "Them Cubs, they ain't gonna win no more." That doesn't sound like how someone would place a magical curse if curses were actually real, but you can't argue with the results. After losing that World Series in 1945, the Cubs wouldn't appear in another World Series until 2016, 72 years after the curse was placed replaced, and 106 years since they'd last won. They did win that year, reportedly breaking the curse. Cleopatra's Pearl Wine. Cleopatra and Mark Antony were having a lovely dinner banquet together. Suddenly, Cleopatra removed a priceless pearl from her earring and dropped it in a glass of wine. Once it dissolved, she drank the wine with a pearl inside it. Some sources say that Cleopatra did this to show her indifference to wealth, and others say that she did it to prove that she could consume the wealth of an entire nation in a single meal. Regardless of her motivation, the way the story is most commonly told now is that Cleopatra dropped the pearl into her wine without provocation. However, the original story, as told by Pliny the Elder, is a little bit different. In the original version, Cleopatra and Antony had made a wager about who would serve the most expensive feast, and this was Cleopatra's way of winning. Pliny also said that the glass was vinegar rather than wine. In ancient times, this story was regarded as a real historical event, though it was later deemed apocryphal. However, that may not actually be the case. According to a 2010 paper published in the National Library of Medicine, the story is actually plausible. Their research concluded that the concentration of acetic acid found in vinegar made from wine was ideal for dissolving a pearl, making this story at the very least plausible. President Taft's unimaginable girth. President William Howard Taft was one of the United States' most accomplished presidents. Not only did he serve as president, he went on to teach at Yale before being appointed to the US Supreme Court and becoming Chief Justice. But despite all of this, there is only one thing that people...
And that was his life's goal, was to be a Supreme Court Chief Justice. That was what he wanted more than anything else. Being the president, but he went on after his presidency to continue to serve the country, and I think that's most presidential candidates now, or presidents, as soon as they are out of office, they retire. And you'll hear them giving speeches and stuff like that. You rarely hear about the ones that, well, they disappear. But people like why did his name Grover Cleveland, even not Grover Cleveland, Taft. I'm looking for his book, so the name would pop to me. There it goes. William Howard Taft. John Quincy Adams, after his presidency, only did one term. He went back and got elected back to Congress. 17th President Andrew Johnson was almost impeached. Well, he was impeached, but he wasn't convicted. He ended up getting elected to Tennessee State Congress or something like that. But, you know, he was a terrible person. He was drunk at his own inaugural. So, but, you know.
Really remember about Taft. He was a big dude. At 6 feet tall and 340 pounds, Taft was America's fattest president. As the story goes, Taft was so fat that he actually got stuck inside a bathtub in the White House. The rumor was popular even back when Taft was president, and its origins are impossible to nail down. What we can tell you, however, is that it is entirely untrue. Of course, that's not to say that a standard bathtub being unable to accommodate the president was not a concern. Instead, he had a custom bathtub installed, one that was large enough to seat 4 typical size men comfortably. When going to inspect the progress on the Panama Canal, Taft even had a special bathtub installed aboard the USS North Carolina for his trip. The tub was over 7 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. Origin of the potato chip. If you've ever worked a retail job, you've undoubtedly had at least one nightmare customer. For George Crumb, a chef at Moon's Lake House in Saratoga Springs, New York, that customer walked through the door on August 24th, 1853. The customer ordered a plate of French fries, but he kept sending them back to the kitchen. Each time Crumb made the fries, the customer complained that they were either too thick, too soggy, or not salted enough. After finally getting annoyed with the customer, Crumb cut some potatoes as thin as he could, fried them until they were crispy, and doused them with salt. To his surprise, the customer loved them and Saratoga chips were born. That brand of chips still exists to this day, but is there any truth to the story? Well, we can't say for sure. It's certainly possible that Crumb made potato chips while trying to please a pain-in-the-ass customer, but the story may have been invented later as a marketing tool. Either way, it's somewhat irrelevant, as Crumb did not invent the potato chip. Though he did help popularize them in the United States, a recipe for potato chips was published in an 1817 cookbook that was a bestseller in both the US and the UK. The recipe book didn't refer to them as potato chips, but there's no disputing that that's what the recipe would make. Signing of the Magna Carta.
There's a really good joke by, he's deceased now, comedian Mitch Hedberg. He had this joke about Pringles. And, you know, Pringles come in a can. I'm just giving an example. They come in a can. And you can pop the top and you dig out the really thin potato chips. And they're like compressed with just like scrap pieces of potato. And they're compressed and cooked. And that's how they get their shape. But he had a really good joke about Pringles. He said he thinks that the day Pringles had made their cans, and that day they were expecting tennis balls. And instead tennis balls, potatoes showed up, and they just said, okay, well, let's just cook them up. It's a very funny joke. R.I.P. Mitch Hedberg.
June the 15th, 1215 is one of the most important dates in history. On that day, King John signed the Magna Carta, widely regarded as the most important document in the development of modern democracy. However, why he signed it is sometimes a matter of disagreement. There are the two most common stories, and then there's the truth. One of the popular versions is that John was tricked into signing the document. He is often viewed as being an incompetent and ineffective leader, with England losing a significant portion of land that it had gained thanks to his father, King Henry II, and his brother, King Richard the Lionheart. John is also typically the villain in stories about Robin Hood, in which he is frequently bested and outsmarted. As such, the idea that he may have been tricked into signing the Magna Carta without understanding it became one of the main narratives. The other common belief is that John signed the Magna Carta out of the goodness of his heart, signing it out of a sense of justice for the people of England. Of course, this is completely at odds with what is known about King John's character. He was known for being spiteful, cruel, tyrannical, and arbitrary in his judgments. In reality, John's feudal barons revolted against him because of his overall behavior. After being confronted with an army much larger than what he would have been able to muster, John was forced to sign the Magna Carta by his barons. President Lincoln's Little Woman. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became incredibly popular. The novel was a harsh depiction of life for African American slaves, and it helped turn public opinion in favor of abolition. It was also controversial, with slave owners and fans of slavery in general claiming that it was an inaccurate representation and was just abolitionist propaganda. When the Civil War broke out, Stowe traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Lincoln. He greeted her by saying, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." It's a commonly referenced quote, but there is no evidence that it was ever said. Though the quote gained public attention after spending years as Stowe family law, there is no evidence that Lincoln ever made this specific remark, and Harriet made no reference to the quote herself. That said, it's not entirely impossible either. Though most historians believe the statement by Lincoln was entirely apocryphal, there was one thing that Stowe and her daughter Hattie, who traveled with her to the White House, were very clear on. Lincoln was an absolute riot. Stowe wrote to her husband, "I had a really funny interview with the president," while Hattie said, "I will only say now that it was all very funny, and we were ready to explode with laughter all the while. I am a jelly donut."
Yeah, I have heard that wasn't exactly true, but I can also see it being said as a joke, just clearly as a funny thing. And I heard that there was an interview, and I heard that it was, Lincoln was a funny guy. He was a funny dude.
June the 26th, 1963, President John F. Kennedy stood in West Berlin in front of the Berlin Wall to give one of the most memorable speeches of the Cold War. He spoke of freedom and democracy, but unfortunately, he made a terrible mistake. JFK was known to struggle with foreign languages, and he ended his speech with the phrase, "Ich bin ein Berliner," meaning, "I am a jelly donut." The audience erupted with laughter over this gaffe, and German political cartoonists had a field day with the speech for weeks. JFK had meant to say that he was a citizen of Berlin, but adding the article ein completely changed the meaning of the sentence. That's the story most people know today, but it originated in a 1983 spy novel, Berlin Game. It was a one-line remark from a fictional character who was an unreliable narrator, but 5 years later it got picked up as actual news. It's almost baffling that this myth has persisted for so long, as footage of the speech is readily available. Anyone can see for themselves that nobody laughed at the president, instead erupting in thunderous applause. To start, what he said was in fact grammatically correct. It was written for JFK by his translator, a native German speaker, who even gave him a phonetic pronunciation guide so he wouldn't screw it up. And although a Berliner is a type of jelly donut, people in Berlin and the surrounding area had a different word for them anyway. But even if that wasn't the case, and the statement did have two possible meanings, it's safe to assume that the German people would have understood what he meant in context. Jimmy Stewart for governor. Despite spending decades in Hollywood, Ronald Reagan was never really a leading man. Women thought he came across as too nice, so he was mainly a character actor relegated to the role of plucky sidekick. It was rare for Reagan to receive top billing in a movie, and half the times that he did, it was only because his co-star was a literal chimpanzee. This was perfectly articulated by Jack Warner of Warner Brothers. When Warner found out that Reagan was running for governor of California, it stated that his immediate reply was, "No, Jimmy Carter for governor, Ronald Reagan for governor's best friend." friend. Despite being reported in Time magazine, it's unclear whether Warner actually made this statement or not. Reagan was known for his sense of humor, so it's quite possible that he made the story up as a joke. Walt Disney was frozen. Aside from being an incredibly adept businessman, Walt Disney was a fan of science fiction and futurism. Though it's now little more than a miniature World's Fair thanks to Walt's brother Roy, the Epcot Center originally stood for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. It was meant to be a glimpse into the future, and Disney was often on the cutting edge of technology within the film industry. It only made sense that such a forward-thinking individual would have his body cryogenically frozen upon his death, a theoretical technology that was entering the public consciousness for the first time right around the time Disney died in 1966. The following year, reports came out that this had happened, and everybody just kind of went with it. Not only did it seem to make sense as something Disney would do, but there had been no large funeral. Even back in the 60s, it was common for celebrities to have massive public funerals, so perhaps Disney didn't have one because there was no body to display. And it's true that there wasn't a body to display, but that's because Disney was cremated. He was a notoriously private person, so a large funeral would have been a strange decision. Instead, a small ceremony was held where his family interred his ashes in the family mausoleum. So how did the story start? It seems to have first appeared in a tabloid the year following Disney's death. A writer claimed to have broken into a hospital by posing as an orderly and seen Disney's frozen body with his own eyes. The story got picked up and repeated, first by other tabloids, then by actual respectable news outlets, and it spread simply because people found it believable. Julius Caesar was born by cesarean section. It's long been stated that Julius Caesar was born by cesarean section. It is usually...
Why does it not look like a child, but like a dog person? She gave birth to a dog person.
He said that the C-section was named after Caesar, though some accounts state that he was instead named after the procedure. He is often reported as being the first person born through this method, claiming it as the reason it was named after him. However, none of this is actually true. Regardless of what they were called, C-sections had been around for quite some time by the time of Caesar's reign and were not an invention of the Romans. The procedure's name comes from Lex Caesare, which was the law governing C-sections. Under the law, it was mandatory that any pregnant woman who died or was dying had to be cut open so the baby could be removed. But while this procedure had already existed for some time, it was nothing like how it exists in modern medicine. Once a woman was cut open, there was no sewing her back up. That's why it was only performed on those who were already dead or dying. Though this rumor about Caesar dates back to at least the 10th century, we do know that it can't be true because Caesar's mother, Aurelia, survived his birth. Alice Cooper's kittens. Alice Cooper was in the business of shocking his fans at concerts, so much so that he is often referred to as the godfather of shock rock. However, one stunt he performed on stage went too far for most people's sensibilities, though apparently not too far for the audience that night. At the start of one show, Cooper took to the stage carrying a bag of kittens with him. He then declared over the microphone, "I refuse to play until all these kittens are dead," before tossing the bag into the audience. Cooper's fans did as their idol had instructed them to do, and the show went on from there. Chances are you find this story to be impossibly absurd, and you'd be correct. However, many outraged parents believed otherwise, and this apocryphal tale has persisted as part of Cooper's mythos, believed by those that seek to vilify music that they find inappropriate. Of course, this wasn't the first time that a story like this had appeared. Before Alice Cooper, a similar story circulated involving Ozzy Osbourne. Years later, an AOL chain letter warned of Marilyn Manson pulling an identical stunt with puppies. These fake reports of grotesque acts were a common way for people to garner support in vilifying anyone whose music they had some sort of moral opposition to. Decades later, Cooper was asked about the rumor during an interview. He laughed and said that he didn't remember it, but that he was probably the one who started the rumor. The cow that caused the Great Fire. Over the course of 3 days, in October 1871, the Great Chicago Fire raged across the city. It destroyed 17,000 buildings, left over 100,000 residents homeless, and claimed the lives of 300 people. And how did this terrible fire begin? Well, that would be Mrs. O'Leary's cow. The fire was believed to have begun at around 8:30 p.m. on October the 8th, in or near the O'Leary's barn on DeKoven Street, as the shed next to their barn was the first building destroyed in the fire. The most popular explanation is that Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over the lantern, and that started the blaze that would engulf the city. There's absolutely no evidence to support this theory, but there was no evidence to support any other theory either. The Midwest was in the middle of an intense and prolonged drought. Strong winds from the southeast would have easily helped a fire spread, and there were widespread fires across the entire region at the time. With how extremely flammable the weather had left the city, even the smallest spark could have caused the fire. Since anything or anyone could have been at fault, and there was no evidence or reason to suspect an intentional act of arson, people likely just decided it was better to blame Mrs. O'Leary's cow rather than to start a witch hunt. Bra burning. The United States saw a large feminist movement in the 1960s and 70s. One of the most iconic and evocative images of this movement were bras being burned. Women were invited to remove their bras, seen as a symbol of male oppression, and cast them into a roaring bonfire. That's how people seem to remember it anyway, and it certainly does paint a rather vivid picture. In fact, the idea paints such a vivid picture that most people never stop to realize that the only images that exist of these bra burnings are the mental images that they conjure in their imaginations, because it never happened. At least, it mostly never happens. The protest that is cited as sparking this movement took place outside the Miss America pageant in 1968. There was a metal trash can, labeled as the Freedom Trash Can, and women were invited to throw things like mops, lipstick, and high heels inside. Some threw bras as well, but they were bras they had brought with them separately. A single passerby saw the protest and carefully removed her bra under her shirt, tossing it into the Freedom Trash Can. This single act made national headlines and became a symbol for the entire feminist movement. However, nothing thrown in the metal bin was actually lit on fire. There were many similar protests around the nation following this, and amongst all these protests, there is a single report of bras being burnt, despite it being remembered as the defining characteristic of the movement: the War of the Stray Dog. The incident at Petrich was a small military incursion between Greece and Bulgaria in October 1925. Tensions had been escalating between the two nations throughout the beginning of the 20th century due to disputes over Macedonia and Western Thrace. They had engaged in open conflict multiple times, with Greece emerging victorious, but this was supposed to be a time of peace. Unfortunately, a Greek soldier's dog got away from him, crossing the border into Bulgaria. He chased after the dog, and Bulgarian border sentries opened fire on the Greek soldier, killing him. This resulted in a 10-day conflict, with Greece invading Bulgaria and killing 50 people, mostly civilians, before the League of Nations intervened and made them put an end to the fighting. The story of the conflict's origin is why it is sometimes referred to as the War of the Stray Dog. An alternate story suggests that Bulgarian forces crossed the border and attacked a Greek outpost. Since neither side was going to be eager to claim fault for the fighting breaking out, we will likely never know whether or not the war was really started by a dog. Hugo Boss designed the Nazi uniforms. Born in 1885, Hugo Boss was a German businessman who founded the luxury fashion house Hugo Boss AG. He was also a supporter of the Nazi Party, having joined in 1931 before Hitler even came to power. As such, there is a persistent rumor in modern times that Hugo Boss designed the Nazis' uniforms. While this isn't accurate, it is a simple misunderstanding rather than an outright fabrication. The iconic Schutzstaffel uniform was manufactured by Boss, but it was designed by German graphic designer Walter Heck, who was unaffiliated with Boss's company. Boss was manufacturing Nazi uniforms even before joining the Nazi Party, but afterwards he became a big supplier, manufacturing uniforms for both the SS and the Hitler Youth. Not only did Boss benefit by obtaining these manufacturing contracts, he was also given access to slave labor along the way, providing further financial benefits. So, while Hugo Boss was an active supporter of the Nazi Party who manufactured uniforms for them, he didn't actually design them. If the luxury fashion designer had been responsible for designing the SS's uniforms, their hats probably wouldn't have been decorated with a skull and crossbones.
All right. So, how many did you know were not true? I would say there's probably about 15 of them that I didn't know about. Maybe, what was it? Maybe another 15 that I knew. So that's 30. The other 20, it sounded legit, I don't know. All right. Well, I'm going to end this here, and I'm going to call it a night. So, I hope you enjoyed part 3. Hope you enjoyed all of them. So until next time, have a good day, have a good night.